Martin Lawrence and Katt Williams did not need to be in the same room to be aware of each other's work. The circuit is not large enough, the tradition they both drew from not wide enough, for two comedians operating at their respective levels of intensity and specificity to exist in complete isolation from each other's reputation. By the mid-2000s, both names were in the wider culture. Both voices were in wide distribution. Both men were known to the other in the way that serious practitioners of the same form are known to each other, even when their professional paths have not directly intersected. What had not happened by that point was the same stage, the same festival, the same night in the same building in front of the same audience. Their careers had developed in a near parallel that never quite produced the collision that the similarity of their trajectories seemed to make likely. Different touring schedules, different production cycles, different management strategies. The ordinary logistical reasons why two people who exist in the same professional world can spend years in it without sharing the same specific event. A comedy festival in the mid-2000s ended the parallel. Both were booked, both appeared, and the audience that arrived at the festival knowing they were going to receive both of them on the same night had the experience of receiving something that neither performer had produced for them before. The specific electricity of a room that contains, simultaneously, two voices it is known separately and is hearing for the first time in combination. Here's the thing about that electricity that is hardest to account for. Neither Martin Lawrence nor Katt Williams had any formal relationship to each other's set that night. No callbacks, no references, no explicit acknowledgement of the shared stage. They simply both performed. And the room, which had received both, understood something about the connection between the two voices that the two voices themselves could not have demonstrated in isolation. What the room understood, and what it gave back to the people who were in it, is the part of that festival night that the formal record does not capture. And it begins not with what happened on stage, but with what happened in the backstage hour before either of them got there. The question Martin Lawrence asked Katt Williams in the festival backstage has been described, by the people adjacent to the exchange, as coming from a specific place in his own experience of the form. A question that a comedian asks another comedian when the formal pleasantries have passed, and what remains is the shared experience of having done the same work in the same tradition for a long time. He asked about the material, about the relationship between the material that a comedian develops over years of circuit work and the material that a comedian performs when the circuit work has produced a career at the scale where the audience is different, and the room is different, and the relationship between the comedian and the performance has necessarily changed. About whether the thing that is carried forward from the circuit work is the same thing that the circuit work was, or whether it is a different version of it, refined, changed, translated into a different format, and what the comedian experiences in the translation. This is a question that can only be asked by someone who has been through the translation themselves, who has experienced the specific change that happens to a voice when the rooms get larger and the production becomes more sophisticated, and the audience arrives with expectations that have been formed by prior exposure rather than by the surprise of discovery. A question about what the comedian keeps and what the comedian loses when the career moves from one scale to the next, and whether what is kept is still the real thing, or whether the real thing is something that only the circuit's specific conditions can produce. Katt Williams answered it honestly, not with the managed honesty of a professional interview, with the actual honesty of a conversation between two people who are in the same tradition and who both know that the tradition is hard enough without pretending it is different from what it is. He spoke about what the material goes through as the rooms get larger, about what stays and what requires active maintenance to keep, about the specific vigilance that keeping the real thing in the larger rooms requires, the vigilance that the circuit's immediate feedback loop provides automatically, and that the larger rooms do not, because the larger rooms do not give back the same quality of real-time information. Martin Lawrence listened with the particular quality of attention that a question receives when the answer is what the question was hoping for, when the person being asked has the information the questioner needed and is giving it clearly. And here is the thing about what followed that exchange that changes how the performances that night should be understood. Martin Lawrence's comedy in the mid-2000s occupied a specific position in the tradition that had produced him, the position of a voice that had been through the full commercial cycle of the form, the television show, the arena tours, the film career, and that retained the specific quality of the stand-up tradition underneath all of it. His comedy was rooted in observation at the level of the personal, the specific experiences of a specific life, rendered in the language of the form at the register where the personal and the universal overlap. The form at its most persuasive, where the comedian is describing something that is true of their own experience and is simultaneously true of the audience's in a way that the audience only recognizes when it is named. Katt Williams occupied a different position in the same tradition, at the same period. His roots were in the circuit's development process, the accumulation of live work that the form requires before the larger career becomes possible. His specials were in circulation. His touring scale was growing. His voice was in the process of reaching the wider recognition that the preceding years of circuit work had built toward. The specific quality of his comedy, the speed, the observational precision, the specific kind of physical intelligence that his performance brought to the material, was becoming visible to the wider culture in the way that only distribution at scale makes visible. Two different positions in the same tradition, at two different points in the same developmental arc. Both men carrying the form in the specific way that their respective paths through it had produced. In the backstage before the festival show, they were in the same corridor for the first time. And what the people who were present describe is not the collision that the near parallel nature of their careers might have predicted. What they describe is ease. The specific ease of two people who have never formally met, but who already know each other in the way that serious practitioners of the same form know each other, through the shared language of the work, the shared understanding of what the form requires, the specific recognition that passes between people who have done the same difficult thing in the same tradition over the same years. And then something happened in that backstage corridor that nobody present had anticipated. Martin Lawrence asked Katt Williams a question. And the question turned out to be the question that neither of them had been asked before by someone who was qualified to ask it. Both men performed at the festival that night. The audience received both performances in the sequence the festival had organized, the order of the bill, the pacing of the evening, the structure that the production had built around two performers who had never shared a festival before and would not share one in quite this configuration again. What the audience experienced, what the people who were in the house for both performances have described, in the specific way that audiences describe evenings that gave them something they hadn't anticipated, was not two separate performances that happened to occur on the same night. It was a single evening with a specific character, produced by the combination of both voices in the same room in the same hours, in a way that neither voice alone would have produced. The first performance had raised the room to a specific level. The second had taken the room from that level and carried it further. Not because the second performer was better than the first, but because the room they were performing into had been opened by what preceded them. And an open room receives differently from a room that is still finding its relationship to the evening. The festival crowd had come with individual investments in each of the two performers. They left with a different kind of investment in what the two voices had produced together, in the specific quality of an evening where the parallel had finally converged, where the voices that had developed in near isolation from each other had been placed in the same room, and the room had discovered what both of them, simultaneously, were. This is the thing about parallel careers. Careers that develop in the same tradition, in the same era, at comparable levels of seriousness and skill, without ever formally intersecting, that is rarely acknowledged. The parallel itself is productive. The fact that two voices have developed separately, without influence on each other's specific choices, means that when they finally share a room, the room receives them without the expectation of similarity. The audience is free to notice what the voices have in common rather than what distinguishes them, because neither voice has been presented to them as a response to or a version of the other. Martin Lawrence and Katt Williams shared a stage once at that festival. The night produced what it produced in the audience, in the backstage corridor, in the conversation between two comedians who asked each other real questions and got real answers. And then both men returned to the parallel trajectories that the festival had briefly converged. The audience that was there carries what the evening gave them. What the evening gave them was not a historic event, not a documented collaboration, not anything that the formal record of either career includes. It was simply a room that held two voices from the same tradition on the same night, and found, in the combination, something that neither voice had shown the room on its own. That is what happens when parallel careers finally occupy the same space, not competition, not collision, but a kind of completion. The room receiving in a single evening what the tradition had been producing, in parallel, for years.